Wanted to first say thank you, Paul, for agreeing to do this webinar. We met, I think, back when I was running a nonprofit focused on regulation, and I think you were still at the AG's office in Arizona, and I was just super curious to learn about what you're doing, and that's how we initially connected. I followed you through going to the CFPB. Obviously, I started Esper, which is the company that I run. It's a regulatory management company for government agencies. And I wanted us to connect and do a webinar, ask a few questions, and really spread information and resources for financial regulators that we work with. So format of today, we've gone over it, but for everyone that's joined the webinar, I'm going to give you an introduction, of course. We'll dig into some questions. And then at the end, we'll have time for the audience to submit questions as well. We are recording this webinar, so in the event that, if people that can make it, we're going to be able to send it to them afterwards. Sound like a plan?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, of course. So for everyone that's joined, Paul Watkins is a managing director at Patomak Global Partners. In this role, he focuses on state and federal regulatory issues around fintech, everything from payments, consumer and small business lending, data privacy, digital assets. Before Patomak, he founded the Office of Innovation at the CFPB. Did some really cool stuff there that we're going to dig into. And then most notably, I think, and really cool, he helped design the fintech regulatory sandbox in Arizona a few years back. So we are going to dig into all of this, but I thought maybe a good place to start would be asking you to describe how the financial regulatory landscape has evolved over the past few years.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that question, and thanks again for having me on here to have this discussion. And thank you for the effort that you are making to help governments innovate. It's a constant challenge, but as you mentioned the question, I think we're on a really positive trend, and frankly, I've been quite encouraged recently. And I say that just comparing where we are now to where we were even a couple of years ago. I remember when I first came to the CFPB, and it was the summer of 2018, and showed up and said, the leadership said we're focusing on innovation. We brought in Paul Watkins. We're going to do a sandbox. We're going to do these other things. And the response was pretty partisan and fairly negative. I remember the New York DFS director at the time immediately said, "Well, sandboxes are for children. Why would you want one?" And my initial thought was, how sad, because actually, in a sense, you're right. So let's have a conversation. Can we have a dialogue about this? Because the fact is, and I don't want to push the analogy too far, but you put kids in a sandbox before they're on a playground a lot of times, and that's essentially the idea we're talking about here. We're talking about a small company or a limited project, and providing a space for this thing to come on the market. And then, of course, we want fully functioning companies that are subject to the full regulatory burdens. But guess what? Not everybody can do that right off the bat. Not everybody has the capital to do that right off the bat. So let's have a dialogue. And I think we're in a much better place now. I mean, now, even if you look at New York DFS, they have a whole division. They've titled it an innovation division. They brought in a guy named Matt Homer, who's doing great things. It's issued, I think, they've issued 30 virtual currency licenses. California, again, added innovation to the title of their department. So those are the two, and to my knowledge, the only two consumer protection focused agencies in the country that have explicitly incorporated innovation into the title of the agency or a department. And those two agencies were probably the most opposed to what we were trying to do on innovation at the CFPB only 2 years ago. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism, and I really hope the current administration makes use of what's been learned at the state level over the past couple years with folks who have been governing and have and have been following and improving processes in this area.
Yeah, that's really cool. California and New York are obviously some bellwether states. So if they, introduce innovation, I think that it looks like, others would likely follow. You touched on it briefly, but I would love for you to give sort of like a layman's definition of how a regulatory sandbox works practically. I understand it at a high level, but would love to learn sort of the mechanics of it.
Sure. And I have a simple mind when it comes to definitions. So I just break it into two pieces. So you got sand and you've got a box, right? That's how that's what you need in your sandbox. So the sand is whatever makes this an environment, a good environment to experiment. So you need to be providing some sort of benefit that doesn't exist in the rest of the market. And usually, if you look at the FCA's example, that is, instead of getting a license, you go through the sandbox process. For the Arizona version, it was an alternative to a license, and you could also waive certain regulations. Utah has kind of a comprehensive, tell us what regulation you want to waive, and as long as it's not a tax, we might let you waive it. So that's the sand. This is a better place to experiment than the rest of the market. And then the box is the parameters. You can only do this for a certain period of time, for a year, for 2 years, maybe to a limited number of customers. This is a temporary thing. You're not supposed to stay here forever. You're supposed to get out of the sandbox at some point and operate as regular companies do.
Got it. Yeah, that's interesting that you say Utah sort of expanded this to all industries, because until recently, I think that my only exposure to sandboxes has been in fintech, and in financial regulators sort of easing regulatory hurdles for smaller companies, right? In usually the goal is to encourage innovation, but also I would guess encourage smaller businesses and companies to set up shop in your state, right? Would you agree, or do you think there are other benefits as well?
I think that is a big motivation, especially for the legislators. And I think Utah and some of the other states have actually set this up in kind of a department of opportunity. I was at the time in Arizona, I was in charge of civil enforcement, which included consumer protection. And this sort of grew out of us realizing the limits of enforcement actions. We can shut down a bad company, we can get people their money back, but we don't bring better products to market. And until there's a better product, we're just going to keep playing whack-a-mole where we take out the worst actors, but we're not really all that happy with the choices that consumers have. So how can we help bring some better stuff on the market? But a lot of these now are run out of innovation offices. So the enforcement on development offices. So the focus is on job growth, but there's a really key element here, and that running a sandbox forces you to engage in a very substantive way with whatever the innovations are that are happening in your state. And that forces the regulators to be up to speed on everything that's going on. And that's extremely valuable because, in my view, the main risk to consumers is not necessarily innovation. It's ignorance on the part of the regulator on the ramifications of innovation. Innovation, I think, is very positive, but if the regulator doesn't understand what's going on, I think that's where harm can be introduced in the market.
Got it. Yeah, it's interesting. For a while, I thought that the departments of economic development or whatever were really sort of like a pony shows, where governments like go to China and like try to encourage a manufacturing plant to move to Kentucky or something like that. But it's interesting that they've moved to a more sort of tactical approach through sandboxes. I think it would be interesting to dig into that a little deeper. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the sandbox in Arizona was the first one in the US. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Essentially, I went to this. It's sort of like venture capital pro bono, where venture capitalists come out of Silicon Valley and they fly into some other market, and they try to be nice, but essentially they say, "Here's why we don't spend too much time here."
Hmm.
And they give different reasons. We have a great talent pool. Everybody will come to Sandhill. These things are accessible, skilled workforce and all that. And so we thought, well, I went back and talked to Evan Daniels, who's now the banking commissioner there, and said, well, we've got to come up with something new. And we went around and researched and saw what the FCA was doing, and said, why can't we do this at the state level?
Hmm.
And the attorney general was very supportive. I don't know, Mark Brnovich, I don't know if there's another attorney general in the country that would have been the first through that door to say, I'm going to endorse this concept and get behind this and put my reputation behind it. But he did, and I think it's been a great thing for the state.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I'm sure that, especially with the past year and people moving towards a more remote first environment, people aren't aggregating in the same places anymore. It's not just the coast. People want to live in Montana and Wyoming and do business there. I'm from Arkansas. One day would love to go back there. Most likely. But, to do that, like, you got to have a good business ecosystem and regulators that are on top of it and up to speed, like you said, and understand the ramifications of innovation. And I think sandboxes are really, low risk, high reward, I might wager, way to do it. What kind of resistance did you face when you were initially trying to get this done in Arizona?
Well, it was really remarkable, and frankly, I don't know. There were a lot of folks who came out at one point at the initial hearing who came out and opposed it. And I think it was in the House before one of the House committees in Arizona, and I was testifying there and looked over, and I can't remember all the different religious groups that were opposing, but I'm pretty sure it was, Catholics and Lutherans and Methodists. And I remember thinking I've somehow, united these religions that have been disagreeing for hundreds of years, and they're all against fintech sandboxes. I don't know if they still would be at this point. I think the understanding, people who had been involved in financial services and regulatory change had basically two categories. There are banks and there are payday lenders, and these are the groups that push for change. And fintech, even 3 or 4 years ago, was kind of unknown. And so people thought, well, this is not a bank thing because it's introducing more competition, so it must be some backdoor payday lending thing, and maybe we don't really understand it,
Mhm.
but we're gonna, but that must be what it is. So I think that may have been the reason for a lot of the opposition, and we went out of our way to clarify that we weren't trying to bring harmful actors in. But at this point, the World Bank has a group called CGAP, Consultative Group to Assist the Poor, and they came out with a massive paper on regulatory sandboxes in emerging countries and how they should be designed and all these sorts of things. So at this point, I don't think anybody's going to accuse the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor on trying to facilitate payday lending. So I think we've moved past that point, and whoever tries to introduce sandboxes in the future, I mean, the DC is looking at a sandbox, right? So I think whoever does it in the future will have a much easier time. In fact, I think Utah's legislature, at least one of the chambers, passed their comprehensive sandbox unanimously.
Mhm.
So that, I think, demonstrates that the conversation has changed, and people recognize the purpose here. And I think this is something that folks can get around. But yeah, the first person through the door probably gets hit a few times.
Sure, understood. Got it. And, reflecting back, what were some of the outcomes that you saw from the sandbox? Because really, like we've said, sandbox is kind of almost an experiment, right? To see how is it going to go, and then ideally you have some learnings and takeaways you can implement further. So curious to know what those takeaways were.
Yeah, so I think the answer to that question is really going to come out this year, because the sandbox was essentially a 2-year a 2-year pilot. I believe they started out the first few months, eight companies were interested, and so I think some of those will be exiting this year.
Mhm.
There's one that was had designed a token to help reduce some of the risks around cash intensive industries that were having trouble being banked, like maybe it was I can't remember if it was medical or at that point recreational marijuana. There were some money transmission products that had some challenges with the existing regulatory structure. So I think the learnings will be coming out this year as far as the Arizona sandbox. If you look globally, I mean, just about every idea you can think of has gone through the UK sandbox, and been very helpful. So as far as the conclusions, I think sandboxes can work well for launching, getting a new idea off the ground. It doesn't solve scale. So now, as more states are interested in promoting innovation, I think now is really the time for states to start working together and saying, okay, do we really need separate money license transmission regimes? Because they're pretty similar across states. Can we start recognizing each other's licenses? Can we start converging some of these requirements? Can we start reaching out to entrepreneurial companies that are analyzing state regulations to figure out what they say and what the differences are? So I'm hoping that this will be translated into further reform and progress.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I also just thought that, at the onset of COVID, there was sort of just a watershed change of regulations and even a loosening of regulations in a lot of states. My favorite one in Texas is that you can get a margarita to go now. But there are regulations that were changed, to make licensure reciprocity a thing in the Midwest, so they could get more access to healthcare in rural areas, things like that. And a lot of those regulations were emergency rulemakings. They didn't follow the typical process. They just were like taken off the books or loosened because they had to get it done then. And typically the regulatory process can be like a 1 or 2 year time horizon of trying to get a policy shepherded through all the stages and gates. But similarly to the idea of a sandbox, it seems like, okay, it looks like we're on the other side of COVID, and now a lot of governments are looking back at all those regulations they changed back in March and April of 2020 and saying, should we change them back or just keep them? What are our takeaways? Should we just keep licensure reciprocity? What good has it done for our government? I think that's kind of an interesting analogy, and it's a lot of information to parse through, right? And understand what's working in one government that may not work for another, but it's curious to see. You mentioned trying to get more states working together in a coalition. I know we've talked about it briefly before, but I know that you're part of the American Consumer Financial Innovation Network. Kind of a mouthful, but can you describe what that is and how people can get involved in it?
Yeah, so and let me start with a similar initiative called GFIN, Global Financial Innovation Network, and this was something that was started by the UK, the FCA out of the UK, and the idea was, let's get innovative agencies around the world that are interested in sandboxes and so forth together. Let's start talking, interacting, learning from each other, and then launching joint sandbox trials. At the point when we launched the Office of Innovation at the CFPB, there was no U.S. agency that was participated. So I'd worked with the FCA in Arizona and thought very highly of them and reached out, and the CFPB decided, yes, this is something that we want to do. We want to join. So we joined, and that was extremely beneficial. And of course, the next thought, and then fortunately, some US agencies started joining about a year later. And of course, the next thought is, well, why aren't we doing this domestically? If I can talk to MAS and FCA about innovation, why can't I have that conversation with a bunch of state regulators and federal agencies? And so we wanted to, I learned from the Arizona experience of the sandbox legislation, which is if you do something new, everyone is going to assume the worst as far as what you're intending. So that's why ACFIN is so similar in name to GFIN. We're going to signal exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to copy this international thing domestically. And so we followed the same format, and the goal there was to start off with joint office hours so that federal and state regulators would meet with innovation communities, because I think in a lot of ways the federal agencies are not as accessible to people starting companies as they should be. So we want to go into these markets all over the country, not just New York, not just the Bay Area. And so we started that, and then COVID hit. So we started doing some of it online, but that slowed the network down a little bit. And then the hope was from that we can go into joint no action letters and potentially joint sandbox trials. But again, COVID kind of made that kind of stalled us out a little bit. But I think the potential is still there. And so I'm hopeful that eventually you could see that that group's all giving joint no action letters and so forth.
Yeah, that's really cool. It makes perfect sense that we should have one in the US, outside of the UK as well. And I hear you that the federal agencies can be a lot less accessible than state, especially for younger companies. You got to have someone walk you through the door to get into the CFPB or other big agencies. So I like that you're trying to open it up and make it more inclusive. Going back,
and then just on that point, we've tried to change that, and we do have, there's an innovation, and a lot of agencies have this now, innovation point person, innovation mailbox. But again, it's a very scary thing for somebody to reach out and talk to an agency in Washington, and sometimes they just feel more comfortable. There are some states where I go meet with innovators, and half the people in the room have the governor's phone number, because that's just how accessible elected officials are, and they can call them if they have a problem, if they have a question, and that's just not, I wasn't giving out my cell phone number at the CFPB. It's just a different model.
Yeah, different game. Understood. Talking about the CFPB and setting up the Office of Innovation, what are some of your favorite accomplishments there during your tenure?
Well, it was great working with the folks. There's a great innovation. There were a lot of excellent, knowledgeable, innovation-minded folks there, and it was really fun to just kind of get them together in a group and have the support of leadership and say, okay, let's take all the ideas that you guys have thought of. Let's think about what other new ideas we can have, and let's push out some new policies. So I got to. And some great folks that are still there: Ed Blatnick, Will Wade, Gary, Albert Chang, and now there's a new director who wasn't there when I was there, Ann Epstein, but I've been hearing great things about her as well. And so we pushed out a sandbox policy, revised the no action letter policy so that it was a little bit more usable, and then issued a number of no action letters there. And then helped the FCA run GFIN, started up ACFIN domestically, and then generally contributed to the different work streams that were going on within the agency, helped develop an advisory opinion policy. And it was, it was a great experience, and I got to work with some very good people.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the work was really catered towards building a network and opening up resources at the state level. What advice would you give to financial regulators right now, besides joining ACFIN, of course, and trying to gain access to the network? How would you recommend they think about some of the new challenges and innovation happening?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of great models to follow. So I think being part of a network and then building some foundational structures that enable you to engage. You got to engage, and then you got to be able to translate the direction that you want to give the innovation community into a form that's meaningful. And maybe that's a sandbox, and maybe it's a no action letter, and maybe it's an interpretation. But I do think you need those two things: engagement and then meaningful written product. So engagement with the community, engagement with the regulators. And then you can just start with interpretive letters. And once you start engaging, you will find the issues of ambiguity that need to be addressed, and you can start addressing them. But you do have to really go out and try to find innovators, because there's not a natural constituency. This is something I've come to believe after doing this innovation regulatory work at the state and federal level now for a few years. If you just sit back, you will hear from established players who already have trade groups and who are accustomed to interacting with the government. That's who will come through the door, and that's fine. Those are real issues that you need to take seriously. But you have to work to go out and find the person, and this goes to your point about being inclusive, who's not used to interacting with the government, who doesn't have as much capital, who doesn't have a trade association. But those are really important because those are the ideas that might really transform the market, and that you really need to understand as a regulator.
How do you find them?
Well, you get involved in the innovation communities, and you go have meetings with folks, and you listen to a lot of crazy ideas, but you hear some good ones too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a lot of outreach, a lot of being available, and a lot of being patient in talking to folks that don't have the suit and tie and the big name law partner coming in the door to talk to you. But if that's all you hear, it's not the full picture. It's not good enough.
That's fair. It's almost like you need like a matrix that categorizes the feedback that you're getting and the groups that they're coming from. And then I think your translation part is super important too. I mean, I've definitely bent the ear of people before, saying like, this is everything that I think is wrong with like registering to do business in the state of, I won't say, but it's rare that I see the actual translation in action. I think that people are like overwhelmed with information sometimes. And then at the end of the day, you've got so much else to do that you've collected that stakeholder feedback, but then you still have to parse it, make sense of it, and then take action on it. And I think your recommendation of like, it doesn't have to be a full-blown rulemaking. It could be an interpretive letter or statement. Something that is still important and shows that you've listened and are responding, but doesn't necessarily have to be an extremely time-intensive process up front. You can sort of layer these things on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And honestly, I wish that folks who were consistently in the innovation business, some of the funders and so forth, would kind of be a consistent voice for innovation, whatever's coming next. What usually happens, there are a bunch of fintech trade associations now, and I think that's great. It's happened after a lot of these companies have gone public. They've reached a certain level of maturity. They don't have the asset size of some of the folks they're competing against. But that would have been really useful 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And for the most part, it didn't exist. And that's really the I think, most productive engagement point. And maybe I'd like to see that change. Maybe that'll change at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the venture capital ecosystem start to recognize some of the real challenges that their companies are facing and encourage them to speak up earlier rather than later. I think it very much depends on the industry that they're in, though. Like fintech seems established in the sense that like they are going to advocate for what they want and need. But I think that environmental tech is another example. It's still like learning the ropes, and so you've got this really fragmented startup ecosystem with so many different verticals, and some are like somewhat more mature than others, and others are just like beginning to start up. ABC, of course, is one of the lead investors in Esper, and the partner there, Joe, and our co-founder, has always been an advocate for like speaking up. But I think that's just his personality. You've met him. Cool. So a couple more questions, and we'll dig into some from the audience. Where do you think we're headed / who are the pioneers right now? We talked about California and New York, like introducing innovation offices. What's really exciting you right now at the federal or state level?
Yeah, what I appreciated most about California and New York wasn't just that they set up an innovation office. I had that sort of structure at the CFPB. I actually much prefer the structure we had in Arizona, where I was the consumer protection person who also was given by the Attorney General an innovation mandate. I think that is much more effective. And that's kind of the structural approach that you get, again, in New York when you have an innovation division, or like Manny Alvarez did in California. you add innovation to the title of your agency. I'm really respect what Matt Homer's doing in New York, again, with the virtual currency licenses. Recently did a virtual currency tech sprint on how to improve reporting, which I think came up with some really interesting results. Albert Faulkner, I mean, the amount of responsibility that man has with the constant legislative innovation that's coming out of the state of Wyoming is really remarkable. At one point, we were in Arizona. We were trying to keep up, and it wasn't really. It was sort of pro bono. It wasn't really my job, but we drafted a utility token law that got passed and some blockchain legislation and everything. But it didn't develop the kind of following that Wyoming did. So I'm really actually kind of surprised that more states haven't had the banking charter and some of the other innovations that Wyoming's adopted.
Yeah.
But Albert, I mean, is absolutely a leader in this space. And I think a lot of the federal agencies will be as well. Of course, there's an administration change, so we'll see what the mandate is and what the goals are, and hopefully this will be a focus. There were a lot of great reports produced at the end of the Obama administration, and so there's a lot to build on if the administration wants to do that, and they certainly have very qualified people. Again, if this is a goal, and hopefully it will be.
Yeah, well, you beat me to my second question about like what's going on with Wyoming and blockchain, because they're making a lot of headlines these days. And of course, there was Coinbase's recent IPO. Like, it's clear that crypto isn't just a fad; it's a real thing. And financial regulators are trying to figure out, how do we, get our hands around this, or do we? Maybe do you want to elaborate on like what exactly is happening in Wyoming right now? I know you mentioned like a lot of legislation happening, but how is that translating in terms of Albert's role at the banking department?
Well, yeah. So now he's got a special purpose banking charter that he can issue, which has been used a couple times, and very interestingly, the Fed has just put out an RFI saying, okay, how should we? It doesn't specifically mention Wyoming, but how should we treat entities that are trying to access the Fed payment system, and that might not be FDIC insured and so forth. So this is a very big deal. And I should mention the Kansas City Fed, which oversees Wyoming, and Jackie Nugent there is doing some great work on innovation, and I think that combination works pretty well together. That you have an innovative Fed and an innovative state, and I think that makes quite a lot of sense. Wyoming recently amended their LLC law to allow for decentralized autonomous organizations to be LLCs, I think, which is quite innovative. You have to be domiciled in Wyoming, so they said as long as you have a registered agent, that's good enough. I think they'll, some very thoughtful people behind that. Will be a lot of interesting issues to parse through there, but good for them for being on the cutting edge, and being willing to step out in that area. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. One of our very first customers was actually the state or the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And when I tell people that, especially like my Bay Area friends who maybe are a little bit snooty, they're like, why would it be Kentucky? Like, wouldn't a big state like California or New York want to adopt like your interesting technology? But I think actually a lot of the smaller states that don't get as much attention are looking for ways to attract businesses, to show that their state is competitive. And one of the ways that they're doing that is through regulation, and through trying new technologies and trying to be the first mover. So I actually was really grateful to be working with Kentucky, and it seems like Wyoming is doing really cool things too.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let us move on to questions. One of them I know you kind of answered, which was, how did you navigate the challenges that you faced while developing Arizona's financial regulatory sandbox? Anything you want to elaborate on there?
No, it's just important to, I guess, one of the benefits that I didn't mention just goes to your point that once a state, especially when Arizona was the first state to say, yes, we want to do that, even tech companies or finance companies that didn't want to use the sandbox said, well, maybe we'll set up business here because we know now we understand something about the environment and the kind of interaction that we're going to have with the government, and the fact that they want to be accessible and they want to understand what we're doing and that we'll be welcome there. So that was a real benefit. The challenges, when I presented it to the team, and we didn't ask for any staff. So, at one point I was testifying and they said, well, how can you do this without any staff? And I said, well, I'm just going to ask people to work harder, and they want to do it because they're already busy. They're happy to work harder to do something new.
How many
And
applications did you get for the sandbox in Arizona, by the way? Because with no extra staff, I'm sure it was a lot.
yeah, well, we created a committee and just sort of added it to different people's job descriptions, and it was, I think manageable. And again, if you present something innovative and cutting edge, you'll get volunteers. So I actually left a lot of what I know about this is from talking to Evan, who had to run this thing, because I was the CFPB hired me away soon after that thing passed. So I was actually gone before it was implemented. So I don't know exactly how many applications that they had. It was certainly double digits, which again, if you look at global sandboxes, is pretty good for a state. Of course, it's not as much as the UK, but there aren't a lot of Phoenix is not the same sort of financial center as London.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, cool. All right, next question. What are the biggest operational challenges that all financial regulators are facing right now, and how can governments or innovators help?
So I think a key challenge is understanding the technology that they are regulating. And this is a big deal even for extremely well-funded regulators like the CFPB, which has a quite large budget. When I was there, if you were to say, okay, identify all the people with AI expertise and then compare that expertise to the AI expertise within the entities that you are regulating, I don't think that would have stacked up very favorably for the CFPB. I know they've tried to solve that with some hiring to some extent. And that's not a criticism of an agency. That just wasn't part of the hiring criteria when they were building out the roles. So the ability to attract that talent is a real challenge. And I think the agencies are actually going to have to be pretty radical if they want to keep pace, because it's hard to hire somebody like you from the private sector to go into the government. Why would you do that? You can just, you can run your own company. So agencies, for a long time, the financial regulators couldn't compete very well on salary. And then we had the financial crisis, and then they said, okay, we'll start paying people more. I think now, frankly, the agencies are going to have to become largely remote. I don't know if anybody else agrees with me on this. But that's where the tech industry is going, I think, is a remote dispersed workforce. And I don't think the agencies are going to compete if they're not going to be able to compete if they're telling everybody you have to live in Washington, D.C. I can tell you, I was trying to hire a technologist to join the Office of Innovation at the CFPB, and I had to base the position in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually gave up. And we hired another attorney because it's easy, and it was a great attorney, and who contributed. And you can hire good attorneys in Washington, D.C. Hiring tech folks a lot harder.
A lot harder, yeah. Absolutely understand that. We're a tech company, and we've taken we're not going to let boundaries or state lines dictate who we hire. Obviously headquartered in Austin, we've got a team all over the place in Iowa and soon Georgia. So I absolutely agree with that. Big fan. Also, I love a home office setup, so that too. um, okay, next question. How can people with expertise in emerging areas like AI or crypto share knowledge with agencies like the CFPB?
Well, that's a great question. So a lot of times the agencies will reach out and have RFIs, where they're asking specific questions. So that's one way. Another is just is to try to get in and have a meeting and say, here's what we're trying to do. And I think the best context for that is to look a little bit about the statements the agencies are making and to see what they care about. Because I think Peter Thiel, who says if your product's going to be successful, it's got to be about 10 times better than the alternative. And usually that means there's a significant consumer lift somewhere. And that consumer lift probably relates to something that the agency is trying to solve imperfectly through rulemaking and enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't do it because they can't bring a better product to market. So, if they're worried about transaction costs or overdraft fees or underwriting inclusivity, there's a good chance your innovation relates to these things, and you can educate them on that. And they may very well be encouraged to hear that. They may have a lot of questions as well, but they may be very encouraged to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, uh, you know, a sort of blended future where we can have people like readily and freely sharing information back to agencies and really like experts in technology, especially like getting the word out to what's happening in innovation is going to be critical. And you're at the forefront of that. I think that is all of our questions. I really want to thank you again for participating in the webinar. It's actually our first one, so luckily no hiccups yet. But thank you again, and we'll circulate this webinar afterwards online, and you'll have a copy, Paul, if anyone else would like to see it. And yeah, have a great rest of your week.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the chance to participate.
Of course, take care. Bye.